Well, this Ute's not going to build itself, so we're going to get stuck into it and we're going to find out what else is hiding under this sheet. So I am actually a little bit behind on this project. I did want to be a lot further ahead, but the last few weeks I've been battling with an eye problem in both eyes. So for a couple of weeks there, I couldn't do much because I couldn't see, which absolutely sucked. That was not enjoyable. So I really need to start making some progress on this thing. But that also left me with a backlog of suspension jobs to do as well. So I've just been smashing through them to get them out of the way, and then I can focus back on this thing. The suspension work is actually really fun. I'm enjoying doing that heaps. So if you have any shocks that you want tuned, rebuilt, or fixed, or whatever you need doing to them, so anything from your normal shock all the way up to triples, coilovers, hydro bump stops, anything like that, get in touch with me, send me a message on Facebook or Instagram, and I'll be able to sort you out. So before we get into the suspension stuff behind me, I wanted to let you know that the guys at Roadrunner Off-Road have given me a discount code for you guys, and that is DK Off-Road, all in one word, right there, and that will give you a cheeky little discount. I've shopped at Roadrunner for well and truly over 10 years. I've been friends with them for nearly that whole time through four-wheel driving and racing and all that sort of thing. And they've been a supporter of my channel from pretty much the start. I've never ever gone to them and asked for free stuff, but they have helped me out a little bit, and in return I've helped them out a little bit as well. So to be transparent, if you didn't know, a discount code helps you guys out with a bit of a discount, but it also shows how much traffic comes from this channel directly to Roadrunner for sales, and that's something they can measure with this discount code. And that's pretty much how they work. So that gives a business a rough idea on whether it's worth the investment or not into people like me. So any chance you get, put the code in. If it's for $5, $500 or $5,000, put the code in. You're supporting a business that supports people like me. You're getting a discount for yourself, and you're also directly supporting me as well through them. So let's go do some cool stuff. So in this video, what we're going to concentrate on is the suspension up the back here. I've been wanting to develop some parts up the back for a while now. So hopefully, once I've got everything sorted and mounted, then that's stuff that you can buy as well and put in the back of your car. So I've got to cut the factory shock mounts off the chassis end. I've got to clean some stuff up. I've got to brace the coil hats and all sorts of stuff. So I'll go through and show you how to set up bump stop spacings. So this is a question that I get asked a lot. And bump stop spacing can also make a huge difference to your ride quality as well. But that comes down to the shocks you're running and the type of bump stops you have as well. So for starters, I've unbolted the bracketry off the driver's side coil hat, and that houses the fuel line feed and return. It also houses a brake line and all the portion valves set up. This car doesn't actually have one. I'm not sure if that's factory or not. Kind of looks factory, but I don't think it is. Now what I'm actually going to do is get rid of all this, and then I'm just going to have one single brake line running to the back with a manual portion valve adjuster somewhere in the back here. And I'm not going to have any brake lines running over the top of this coil hat because I didn't want it to foul on my shock mounts, and the portion valve's sort of hard to work around in regards to fitting a shock in there as well. So this will all get changed, so that's just sort of tucked out the way. So this software is what the table runs on. So this is just My Plasm, it's called, and then it has a design software that works hand in hand with this called My Minicad. The design software is pretty simple, so you can actually outsource to like Fusion 360 and then import into this software. That's no worries at all. So that's what I'm going to do in the future for more complicated projects. But this is sort of the first thing I've drawn up. So this is a coil hat brace. So that's the top section with the two hats cut out there. And then this is like a front side brace, and this is a back side brace with a couple little holes in it. I was going to do some fancy patterns or some writing or something in the middle between the coils, but I'm going to mount something on there anyway that's going to cover it all up, so there's no point. So I've got a 1200 by 1200 sheet of 5mm on here. It's 350 grade. This is the first time I've actually had a full size or half size sheet on the actual table, and I've probably picked the worst thing to cut out first. It's a pretty big size, so it's going to take up a fair bit of this plate. So in the last episode, you would have seen I've done some test cuts, but I actually haven't cut any big proper thing yet. I'm a little bit nervous, so hopefully nothing plays up because I don't want to waste material because it's, you know, costs money. But it's all set up, ready to go. So all we can do is press play and see if it cuts. Well, that all cut out. So we had a couple little dramas. What happens is if I have the plasma flat out, it trips the power. Because this is still only a temporary setup, you know, it's on an extension lead and whatever, it shouldn't probably be on an extension lead. So it tripped the power. I can only sort of run it at like 3/4 amps roughly, especially on these big long cuts. Like if it was just a short cut, you could run it flat out, but on these long cuts, it was tripping the power. So once it's all set up, I'll get the plasma hardwired in, so I don't really have that problem. But overall, it cut pretty good. So I was adjusting and playing around with the settings throughout the whole process. So there's a little bit of dross on the back side, but the cut itself is like pretty clean. So I'll just go through and I'll just have to clean that up a little bit. Like ideally what I probably would have done is done this in one whole piece and just cut slits down where like these edges are, and then just folded these end bits. You cut slits so it's not so hard to fold, and then you just weld the slit up rather than trying to piece this together as, you know, 3 bits into one. But that's the process of learning this whole thing. So I'll clean these up and we'll set these in place. And then while I'm at it, before this goes in, I've got to cut these shock mounts off so I've got room, and then we'll get into some exciting stuff. Well, that sucked, but it's all cleaned up. My shed was already messy, but now it's an absolute mess, but that's all part of it. So let's get these shocks out and I'll show you what we're running. So there's still quite a few goodies under this sheet, but this is what we're going to be running in the rear. So we've got the Pro Fender 2" by 3" travel hydro bumps, along with the Pro Fender 12" triple bypass shock. So we'll start with the hydro bump stops. I actually have never ran hydro bump stops in the rear, so this is pretty exciting. Now I do really like these bump stops because they've got a threaded body and it's long. So you've got a lot of adjustment here because bump stop height is very important. Now along with this hydro bump, I am still going to be running the factory bump stops as well as a final. In my opinion, that's what you should do, because using just the hydro bump as a final bump stop either means the bump stop's going to case out, which is not much different to your shock tool on it, or you're going to destroy the bump stop, which I've seen many a times with heaps of different brand of bump stops. So they case out or they hydro lock, and then if they hydro lock, sometimes they blow the tops off. So I like to set the hydros up exactly like I would a shock. You know, I have the final bump stop come in at a certain point, and then that final bump stop takes up before the hydro bottoms out. I do have hydro bumps in the front of the race car, but they're just non-adjustable ones. So they're just at a fixed height, and it is a bit annoying. So these adjustable ones will come in very handy. And being a 3" travel, it should give the bump stop enough travel to do what it has to do before the final bump stop comes in. And the idea is I like to have a bare minimum of 100 mil of shock travel before any bump stop comes in. So when I mount the triples, I'm gonna hopefully have 6 to 7" of up travel. So that leaves 4 inches before the bump, and then 3 inches of shaft on the bump, including the final bump stop as well. So these are Pro Fender's 2.5 inch triple bypass shock. I do have these in the front of the wagon and I actually really like it. So the ride quality in that car is really good for how heavy it is. And I've given some proper punishment as well and I've had no issues. The thing that I really like about the Pro Fenders is the clickers on the end of the bypass tubes. As far as I know, they're the only shock that has it. So usually it has like a grub screw and a 1/2 inch nut. So you undo the nut and then you've got a grub screw, but they've changed these to a clicker. So it's engraved on there, soft, firm, so you know which way to go, and pretty much just clicks like that. So super easy to adjust on the go, because if you've tried to adjust the other style of adjuster on the car, you know, you've got to reach in under the wheel. It's never in a good spot. You get muddy and whatever. So to be able to reach under here and just give it a couple of clicks is really handy. The idea of a triple bypass shock is you run the shock, usually the idea is to run it at 50-50. So this is a 12-inch shock. So ideally I want 6-inch shaft showing. So it's 6-inch up travel, 6-inch down. I am going to tweak that, hopefully 7 up and 5 down, but that's all good. And then you've got 3 different ride zones. So when the shock piston is floating around in the middle here, these 2 bypass tubes come into play. And then you've got a zone between this bypass tube and this bypass tube. So this is like your secondary zone. And then that only runs off this bypass tube. And then you have the bump zone. So that just runs off the valving in the shock. So the idea is you can valve the shock real heavy. Well, I do anyway. And then you can open up the bypass tubes to have a plush ride in the ride zone. And then as it goes through the compression stroke, it progressively gets stiffer until you hit the bump zone and it's super stiff. So if you have a real hard hit or whatever, it just progressively gets stiffer and stiffer. So you're not crashing into the bump stop like real hard. Now it's got 1 rebound bypass tube and the concept is exactly the same. So when the shock fully bottoms out, which the piston will be up here, it's in its bump zone. And if it's valved really firm, it stops the shock initially opening up real fast. So you've got a section here where if you case it out and then it doesn't unload real fast. And then you've got between here and here is obviously your ride zone. And then up here is the opposite end of the bump zone. So when it passes this bypass tube here on the rebound stroke, there is a section here that will go back onto the valving, and if it's super stiff, it just stops, initially banging the shock open. I'm going to run limit straps anyway, but that's the idea. It just slows the shock down before it fully tops out. And then the idea is to have some mounts set up so I can on-sell them to you guys if you want to put triples in the rear of your car. I should have a pretty simple mount that should piece together and put these in the back. So I was going to mount the hydro bumps first, but they don't really matter in the scheme of things. I can mount them to however the shocks work, so that's no big deal. So the hydro bumps I'll do last, and I did have a good idea on how to mount them, but I do have to buy some stuff, so that's coming in the mail. But I need to roughly work out my bump spacing here. So this is a factory bump. It's clamped on at the back because of course it broke the back bolt in the chassis. So how I'm going about this is I'm allowing the factory bump stop to crush 40 mil, and that would be under like a big hit or whatever. So 40 mil. So what I'm going to do is actually make a bump stop plate 40 mil off the diff. So I'll quickly draw up some mounts because I need to position the bump stop plate so then I can position the shock mounts and see how it's all going to work together. So let's get drawing. Well, the shocks are in, they've just sort of been dummy fit in here, so I still need to weld everything out. So I'll weld this back rib, I'll weld it from the inside and then grind all this off. So there's still a little bit to do, but the whole process of designing and cutting these shock mounts took a bit longer than I thought. There are limiting factors when doing shocks this way, so I'm limited by the coils, obviously. I'm limited by the chassis, this back cross member, the panhard mounts, and everything's sort of a limitation. So the shocks are mounted in a way that's the least compromising. So ideally I would stand these up a little bit more, but I can't with the chassis there. And then I can't bring the bottoms in much closer because the panhard mount on the diff end. They are slightly lean forward a couple degrees, and cycling up and down on the suspension, they stay sort of forward of 90 degrees just. Angles and the way you mount stuff is quite critical, but not as critical with shocks only. Like if these were coilovers, ideally you would not mount them like this, because the mounting angles can affect the spring rates and the way the springs work, and you have to compensate with all sorts of different spring rates and whatever else. So that's similar to what's in my race car. They're mounted pretty similar to this, and it's not ideal. But seeing as the spring carries the load, the spring being in the factory position is fine, and the shocks can still do their job on this angle anyway, so that's all good, especially with this amount of adjustment in the bypass tubes. I've just had to make it work with the limitations, which is this area. Ideally, I would have liked the top of the shock to be 90 degrees that way and have the bolt go front to back like the diff end. But with the orientation of the bypass tubes, it just was not possible. So it was a little bit trickier to make them out this way. But a lot of the idea with this is to create a kit so you guys can put these shocks in the back of your car. So at least with the plasma table, it'll cut the exact same shape every single time, and then it can piece together like you've seen here. So I am running into slight troubles on full bump. So with the diff all the way on the bump stop, the bypass tubes actually come into contact with this front side of the panhard bracket. And I'm limited as to how much I could move the shocks in, because I've only got this sort of room, you know, probably 15, 20 mil between the panhard and the mount there. So I could probably only sneak that in 10 to 15 mil, which I will, because this left side, the bypass tube just hits the chassis there, but that would be an easy fix. I could just notch that out 5 or 10 mil and that would be fine. It only just hits, but this right hand side is probably the issue. So I'll sneak this bottom mount in as well and straighten the shock up a little bit, but I'll just make it work. I can notch it out, that's no big deal. I could move the top of the shock in as well. Like I could move the bottom mount in, and then I could move the top mount in even more and angle the shock more, but I want to try and stand the shock up as vertical as possible. So yeah, I'd rather take a little notch out of the panhard mount in the chassis to keep the shock as vertical as possible. So I've roughly worked out the suspension travel numbers based off both my other cars, and at around 2-inch suspension lift, we're going to be running about 170 mil of up travel, and that is to full bump. So that's fully collapsed rubber bump and everything. So the whole idea is to have about 110 to 120 mil of free suspension travel where there's no bump stop interference. And then there's about 50 or 60 millimeters of bump zone in the shock, the bump stop, and then the rubber bump as well. And the way these shocks are designed, it actually leaves about 130 mil to 140 mil of down travel, and that will be at a 2-inch spring lift. So that actually has more up travel than my race car, and it definitely has more up travel than my wagon, and they both ride really good. So I'm looking forward to actually testing all this out. It's going to be good. They do stick up a little bit high. It's about 270 mil off the top of the coil brace here, but I couldn't really lower this top mount down because then the bypass tubes come into contact with the panhard mount, and I didn't want to have massive bump stop extensions as well, so I wanted it to be low as possible on the bump stops, so then I don't have to put a massive lift in it to get heaps of up travel. So all in all, it's probably like 5 or 6 limitations, and I've just made it the best I possibly can. Having bypass tubes off it and the res off the side of it as well, like they're a massive shock to try and squeeze in this area, and there's not really many ways you can actually do it, but I think this come up good and I'm actually quite happy with it. So when I come back in a second, this will all be mounted and finalized, and then I can go through mounting these hydro bump stops and explain how I'm going to set them up. Well, the mounts are in, so I haven't fully welded the mounts onto the chassis yet. I'm running low on gas on the MIG, so I need to chase some of that up. And I want to get these bump stops in, so I don't want to run out of gas. But I did make some slight tweaks, like I trimmed some of it up with the grinder, and then I adjusted the drawing on the laptop. But I stood them up another 4 degrees, so they were at 72, and now they're at 77, I think, so 5 degrees up. I also moved the bottom mounts in another 7 mil, I think, and especially this side is pretty much hard up against the panhard. I can't go any further in, and then I just matched it on the other side. So this shock is clear of the chassis at full bump, so before this was slightly fouling, but I've managed to tweak it up and this shock clears. But the opposite side on the actual chassis panhard mount, it actually fouls just on bump. Like if I ran the bump stops 20 mil higher, it probably would clear, but it's like right the last little bit hits the panhard mount. So I'll trim that up and plate it in, it's no big deal. Now I did do this right at the start, but a good thing to remember before you finalize everything is to set the diff exactly where it needs to be. So I've roughly got a 3-inch lift height from the bump stop to the diff. So I set the diff at that height, and then I centered the diff with the panhard at that height, and then I set the pinion angle as well with the upper control arms. I based that off both my other cars so I could get an accurate reading, and that way all the shock angles and that are all correct. And even stuff like the lower mounts or the bump stops, you know, if the pinion angle isn't correct and you weld them on and then you correct the pinion angle and roll the diff either forward or backwards, then them angles are going to be incorrect. So that is quite important to remember before you do any stuff like this. Otherwise you'll be cutting it off and starting again. So I ended up spacing the bump stops 30 mil off the actual diff. I think I was going to go 40, but I decided 30 was a little bit better. The final height of the top of the shock tower is 280 mil off the coil hat. So if you need to measure some up to fit in your car, that's roughly where they sit. And this should give me a fair bit of up travel at about, 2-3 inch lift. So my control arms, panhard, all the arms are still on nice angles, but I've got the maximum amount of up travel that I can get. So it's time to put these in. They're getting mounted directly in the center of the coil. Now, a lot of people put these elsewhere, like out in the chassis. You know, they notch the chassis out and sink these in, but that's something that I don't want to do to this chassis. And seeing as I'm still running the factory bump as well, it's sort of hard to package it out here when I've got to factor in a sway bar as well. So the simplest and easiest spot that's still effective is directly in the middle of the coil. Now, ideally with bump stops, you want them mounted as far out as you possibly can, because if you can imagine having a bump stop, you know, further in on the diff, when that diff hits the bump stop, you've still got a lot of leverage off the tyre to the outside section of the diff, and that's where usually you bend a diff from. So if you have a big case out or something, you usually bend it from the bump stop out. Whereas if you have the bump stops as far out as possible, there's a lot less force inbound of them. And that's why I want to keep the rubber bumps there. So obviously on a cycle of the diff, you know, the diff's going to come up, hit the hydro first, and then it's going to crash into the final bump. So the chances of bending a housing with that sort of setup is substantially less. So I come up with this idea. So this is like a cast steel reducer that goes from 4 inches to 2.5 inches. I've trimmed it up to suit, and this fits perfectly in the top of the coil like that. And then I've trimmed it up so the mounting sleeve fits on just like that. So that'll get welded in there, and then that'll slip in like that and get welded in there. Like, pretty simple really. And having the adjustable height means that you don't have to be 100% exact on where you weld it in. Just make sure both sides are the same and then adjust to suit. So I'll drop the car onto the final rubbers and then quickly get some measurements and we'll tack it in place. So that has come up an absolute treat. It looks awesome. I laid one weld and then I ran out of gas, so I've put a bit of bird crap here that I've got to fix up. I've got to get some gas. But I do have these little tabs that are gonna sort of go in the corner here just to brace the coil towers. And then once I sort of know what's going on in this top area above the brace, then I'll integrate another brace for the top that mounts the res and all that stuff. So they're not 100% finished. I've still got, a couple little things to add, but for the most part, it's probably 95% done. And then I've just got to weld it out. So what I'm going to do with these hydro bumps, I've got to cut a plate with an ID hole the same as the OD is this mount tube. And then I'll do the OD of the plate to slip down in there. So I'll have another plate that'll slip over the top and it'll pick up the very top of this mount, just so there's no, because currently it's only welded, down the base of it. So that could potentially twist. So I'll just, add a brace at the top. And then that'll fill all that in. I'll copper prime behind it. I've got to pull these back out. I'll copper prime this cast bit and clean it all up, make sure it's all good before I weld it in there. I just wanted to get all that in, looking good. But yeah, obviously with no gas, I can't do much more. So as you would have seen, I flexed everything out and it's all good clearance wise. Obviously, the only thing is that panhard mount on full bump, which I'll sort out. But the rest of it's all nice and clear. Under its full weight at full flex, I think the 37 top of it will sit roughly at the bottom of the sill height. So we've still got plenty of down travel, and then at a nice and low ride height, we should have a lot of up travel. So I did have a lot of questions when I installed the long arms and that from Superior about why I didn't go 4-link, and I thought I'll just give you a couple of reasons on why I didn't. So the main reason is I still need this car to be somewhat practical. I know it sort of looks like it's not, but the goal is to still use this car as like a camping car, so it needs to be somewhat practical. Putting a 4-link in the back doesn't make it not practical, but it does take up a little bit of room in this area. So this cross member has to go, and then you have two big mounts up behind the cab here. If it's double triangulated, which I would do, that means your lower arms triangle in and then your up arms triangle out, and they cross over or nearly cross over. So that mount and extra cross member piece, if they have one, takes up a lot of room behind the cab here. Now I know that there's still a little bit of room here, but because the 4-link arms come from the center and diagonal out, and because this is so low on the bump stops, the arms do take up a substantial amount of room here. Now I want this room here between this cross member and the cab. I want all this room in here to mount some stuff I've got going on, and putting a 4-link in just made that a little bit harder. Now another reason is I'm only running 12-inch shocks. When I say only, 12 inch is still quite big, but with the long arms and the 12-inch shocks and the way I've mounted them and the height it is on the bump stops, I don't get a great deal of rear steer anyway. Now a 4-link eliminates most of the or all of the rear steer, and the good thing about a 4-link is there's no panhard, so your diff doesn't go left and right of the chassis, where a panhard works in an arc and it pulls your diff left and right. But in this particular setup, I don't see that as an issue with this size shocks and this setup that I'm running. I was genuinely curious on running the long arms because both of my cars still have standard rear geometry. I haven't changed any of it, and I've been wanting to change it for a while. So especially in the race car, not so much the wagon, but the race car, I specifically wanted to do something like that. But I thought this car would be perfect to do the long arm in, and then if I end up doing something with the race car, it will get a 4-link and some other crazy stuff that I've got in my mind. But I did want to try the long arms. So by all accounts, everyone that puts the long arms in says they're brilliant. So I wanted to try the long arms, and that's as simple as that. And in my opinion, Superior do the best kit with the amount of adjustability, which you would have seen when I installed them, the strength of the arms and the look of them and everything like that. So it ticks all the boxes there. And I did want to try something, I didn't want to go from standard-ish stuff all the way to full-blown custom, wild stuff. Like I'm still running coils and shocks. If I went to a 4-link, I'd want to put coilovers in and potentially bypasses as well. But I do not want to put coilovers in unless they're on the outside of the chassis, which means major chassis modifications. And that's something that I just wasn't willing to do on this car because it stuffs up the whole tray area and where I need to mount stuff and So to have triples, like, they're an awesome shock, and to pair them with a good spring, it's going to be a bulletproof setup along with the hydros. But if I was going to go, you know, through all this effort to do a big 4-link setup, then I'd want a big suspension setup as well. And if all goes well, if this car gets enough interest and, you know, everything snowballs from there, the next car next year potentially will be the race car, and that will probably see, yeah, like 4-link coilovers, triples, and, you know, there's a lot more stuff going on than that. But that's up in the air at the moment, so we'll see. Well, that wraps up this episode. I hope you've enjoyed this one. I've thoroughly enjoyed starting to work out the plasma table and the software and how to do this sort of stuff. I'm looking forward to furthering my skills in this area. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like the video and put a comment down there and let me know what you think of the progress on this car. The next episode will be up the front of the car actually. So I'm really running out of time. It's going to the panel beaters soon and I need to sort some stuff out up there. I've also got things to do to the wagon. We've got Queen's birthday trip coming up, which is always a good trip. I've got shocks lying around that I need to do, so I'm 7 days a week at the moment, lots of hours, you know, it's full noise in here. So I'm going to clean up my shed because I absolutely hate working in mess, and I'll catch us in a fortnight.